Welcome back, life science learners. Let's continue with our lesson today. A recap of what we've just looked at. We've been looking at revising evolution. We've spent some time looking at the basic concept of evolution. We spoke about the 5 principles that underpin natural selection. We looked at some evidence that underpins what facts we use to support evolution as a theory. We've also mentioned that evolution is driven by variation, and we looked at variation as being in meiosis, M for meiosis, M for mutations, which happen during DNA replication, or the randomness of mutations that happen elsewhere during protein synthesis. We also spoke about variations that occur during, if you remember, random fertilization, as well as the random formation of gametes and mates. So that was the randomness of mutations and variation that brings about change and drives evolution. Now let's look at Lamarck's theory and unpack what Lamarck's theory is. So when we talk of Lamarckism or Lamarck's theory, what often comes to mind is the law of use and disuse. And essentially, if we were to put that into a very short, abbreviated statement, it would mean that the more you use something, the better it becomes. And that is what Lamarck put together, the law of use and disuse. And he also inferred that structures or parts that were not used gradually lost their functional use. And so some people often believe that that is true. And so let's test that. Let's unpack the theory. Okay, so he mentioned repeated use of augments would cause it to enlarge and become more efficient. The disuse of an organ would cause it to degenerate. Guys, if we look at these images here, we can see up here, we can see the ancestral shape of the head of the elephant, and we can see that gradually over a period of time that the tusk of these elephants have become longer. So the question is, did it become longer because they used it more often? Or did it disappear because they stopped using it? And so often we think about, well, it kind of makes sense that if we want to use something, the better it becomes. However, guys, think about those things that happen to you. So if you go to gym and if you decide to exercise and if you become really muscular because you've used your arms to exercise, does that mean that when you decide to have the next generation, will they be born strong and muscular like you are? Often not, because that would be something that they would have to train to become, as you would have. So the things that happen to you during a lifetime may not necessarily happen to the next generation purely because they are born as an offspring to you. And that is what Lamarck was pointing to. So let's try and unpack that. So the law of use and disuse essentially points to changes in the environment create needs that cause organisms to modify their existing organs to meet the need. Lamarck did mention that the environment constantly changed, or that there was a selection pressure from the environment, meaning that the environment was not always the same and individuals had to change, either try and reach fruit higher up or had to adapt structures to better survive. So he mentioned that the modifications of an organism acquired during its lifetime could be passed on to its offspring. So essentially, if an individual, as for the example of the giraffes, constantly stretched and tried to reach the fruit higher up, that their necks grew longer. And guys, I challenge you to do that. I mean, if you were using something constantly, yes, it does become better. But the question is, will that characteristic that you acquire, that you get, be passed on to the next generation? Very unlikely. Why? Because characteristics that happen to you or changes that happen to you need to be genetically passed down. And so the genetic inheritance needs to be what drives the inheritance of characteristics from one generation to the next. And unfortunately, Lamarck was not able to convince people using his theory of acquired characteristics. So let's look at his theory. So again, why was his theory rejected? And the concept of rejection is based on not enough evidence supporting what he hypothesized. And so we need to unpack why is it that it is rejected. So organisms do not evolve because they were determined to change by changes that take place randomly due to mutations. Essentially, that points to that individuals don't change because they need to change. Change happens randomly, and that is driven by mutations. So things that happen randomly are not controlled by an individual. Yes, you might exercise to become better, but that is an acquired characteristic that you get. That cannot be passed down to the next generation purely because you've acquired that trait. Likely, all acquired characteristics cannot be inherited. What does that mean? It means that the phenotype changes that affect the genotype, as discovered later by Mendel, cannot be inherited. Let me put that into a simple context again. So what happens to you if you decide to go and get a tan in the sun, or if you were sitting out and getting burnt in the sun? Does that mean that the next generation will be born with darker skin? Unfortunately not, because what you've acquired physically as a darker skin color will not be passed on to the next generation. The next generation inherits your genetic information from the sperm or the egg cell. Cool. So Lamarck's theory, remember the following, guys, that an inherited characteristic is a characteristic an offspring is born with. So a characteristic can only be passed down from the parents through genes, and that comes from the gametes, the sperms and the eggs when they fertilize. Having been inherited from one of the parents, a characteristic is controlled by a factor called gene. Back in the day, Lamarck and Darwin were not able to coin what the term gene was. Much later on, when Mendel unpacked the factor that was used to inherit characteristic, was the term gene coined. So it was very difficult back in the day for Lamarck and Darwin to actually use the word gene as a concept of inheritance. Today we understand that, and hence we can explain this concept much more scientifically. We also need to understand that an acquired characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring is not born with, but develops or is acquired through the course of its lifetime, and are not controlled by a gene. The guiding question when Lamarck's theory is applied to a new situation is the following. What was the original characteristic? What was the challenge that allowed that characteristic to become better suited to the environment? What did the organism do, or what did that characteristic then acquire? And so the things that happen in an individual's life, what was the factor that contributed to that? And hence Lamarck had these questions which he posed. Further guided questions are, what was the result of that selection pressure? Did it cause the next generation to change? And so what happens to the acquired characteristic? Does it then pass on from one generation to the next and to the next, eventually leading to them becoming better or better suited to the environment? And so what was the result of this? And unfortunately, this cannot be supported by the fact that the more some part is used, the better it becomes. Today we understand that genes control the inheritance of characteristics and that mutation drives the change. Let's unpack a bit more. So here's a question that we'll try and wrap this segment up with. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was a French naturalist who proposed his theory of evolution in 1809. Name the two ideas on which Lamarck's theory was based. And guys, if we unpack those two ideas, we spoke about his theory of use and disuse. And secondly, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay? So those were the two concepts, the theory of use and disuse, and his theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Another question. Give 2 reasons why most scientists reject his theory. And guys, it's important that you're able to identify for 2 reasons, 2 well-explained reasons why his theory was rejected. Let's unpack the answer to this question. One reason was that acquired characteristics are not inherited. We know that the only way a characteristic can be inherited is through genes. And clearly he was not able to convince people around that. Secondly, organisms do not evolve because they want to evolve. Individuals don't change because they want to. Change happens because of things that go wrong or go right. So mutations, random fertilization, or the randomness of gametes being fused. And that is what drives change in species. One more question. Was Lamarck's work entirely without value because his theory had been rejected? Interesting question. The answer is no, guys. It is laid on the foundation that traits could be passed down to offsprings, and he attempted to explain how and why species had changed. And from those, he had evidence from fossil records. However, his explanation of that was not conclusive based on his theory that the more some characteristic was used, the better it developed.